A woman stood on a wooden platform in a British military prison, a rope already around her neck, and she was smiling. Not a nervous smile, not a broken one. The same smile the survivors of Ravensbrück concentration camp had described in courtroom testimony months earlier, the smile she wore while women were being beaten in front of her. Guards who witnessed the execution said she looked almost amused, right up until the floor opened beneath her. Her name was Dorothea Binz. The prisoners of Ravensbrück had another name for her, the Beautiful Devil. Ravensbrück itself is worth pausing on before we get to her, because it was not a small operation. It was the largest concentration camp built specifically for women anywhere in the Nazi system, a place tens of thousands of women passed through over the course of the war, run almost entirely, at the guard level, by other women. That detail matters, because it's part of what makes Dorothea Binz's story harder to file away neatly. This was not one man's atrocity carried out by faceless subordinates. It was an institution, staffed, disciplined, and in Binz's case, personally shaped by people who had once been ordinary teenage girls looking for a job. Binz was born in 1920 in a small forester's settlement in northern Germany to an ordinary middle-class family. She left school at 15. She tried working as a maid and hated it. So, at 19 years old, she walked into a local SS office looking for something else, and within days, she was sent to a place called Ravensbrück to train as a camp guard. At the time, Ravensbrück was brand new, built specifically to hold women. Nobody could have predicted that this teenage girl who couldn't keep a housekeeping job would, within 4 years, become one of the most feared people inside its walls. What makes her rise unsettling is how ordinary its starting point was. New guards at Ravensbrück went through weeks of induction before they were ever allowed near the prisoner population. Drills, uniform inspection, lectures on camp regulations, the same bureaucratic machinery any institution uses to turn a civilian into staff. Nothing in that induction explains why one particular teenage girl, barely out of school, would end up remembered by thousands of women as the single most feared person in the camp. Historians who have studied her file describe no unusual background, no prior record of violence, nothing that would have flagged her as different from any of the other young women who arrived at Ravensbrück that same year looking for steady work. She rose fast anyway. By August of 1943, Binz had been promoted to deputy chief wardress, the second highest position a woman could hold in the camp's guard hierarchy. On paper, she answered to a superior. In practice, survivors who lived through the camp later said the official chief wardress was completely overshadowed by her own deputy. Binz was, in their words, the true star of the camp, not because she was liked, because she was feared more than anyone else wearing a uniform there. Here is what that fear looked like in practice. Binz would walk the grounds with a whip in one hand and the leash of her German shepherd in the other, and she used both without warning. She targeted the weakest prisoners specifically, the ones already too exhausted or too sick to defend themselves. And she beat them, kicked them, slapped them, and in some documented cases, shot them, seemingly for the pleasure of it rather than for any camp infraction. Survivors testified that when Binz appeared on the roll call square, silence fell across the entire yard instantly. Thousands of women standing in rows would go quiet the moment she walked into view. That is not the kind of silence that comes from respect. That is the silence of people trying not to become the next name she remembers. Picture that roll call for a second. Thousands of exhausted women, already standing for hours in rows on an open square. In whatever weather that particular morning brought, forced to remain still and silent while the camp's staff walked the lines looking for any reason to single someone out. Most guards were feared in the abstract, a uniform to avoid eye contact with. Survivor accounts describe Binz differently. As someone whose presence alone changed the physical posture of the crowd, thousands of people trying to make themselves smaller at once. That is the kind of detail that doesn't show up in a court transcript's list of formal charges, but it is exactly the kind of detail survivors chose to describe, decades later, when asked what she was actually like. And there is one detail from her role that survivors brought up again and again in later testimony. Binz personally supervised the camp's punishment bunker, the cell block where women were tortured and, in a number of documented cases, killed. Being sent there was, by every survivor account on record, one of the most feared moments a prisoner at Ravensbrück could experience, and Binz was the name most closely tied to what happened once the door closed behind you. This was not a side duty. It was central to what made her position so dangerous. As part of the camp's command staff between 1943 and 1945, she also directed the training of new guards, at times overseeing more than 100 women at once. That training role is easy to skip past, but it might be the most consequential thing on her record, which means the cruelty did not end with her. It multiplied through her. One of the guards, she is documented to have trained, Ruth Closius, went on to become one of the most brutal wardresses in the entire camp system. Someone survivors would later describe in terms almost identical to the ones used for Binz herself. Binz was not just an executioner of small daily punishments. She was, in a very real sense, the source code for a whole generation of camp cruelty. teaching the exact posture, the exact silence, the exact use of a dog and a whip as instruments of control to the women who came after her. By April of 1945, with Soviet forces closing in from the east, Ravensbrück was evacuated, and its guards, Binz included, were marched out along with what remained of the prisoner population. She slipped away during that chaos, trying to disappear into post-war Germany like so many others attempted to. It did not work. On the 3rd of May, 1945, barely a day after Germany's formal surrender, British forces captured her in Hamburg. She was sent to a detention facility that had, until recently, been a subcamp of Buchenwald. The irony of a Nazi camp guard now being held inside a former Nazi camp was not lost on the people processing her. Roughly a year and a half later, Binz stood trial. The proceeding was held at the Curio House in Hamburg, running from December of 1946 into February of 1947, and it became known to history as the first Ravensbrück trial. It was, in its own way, a historic legal event. This was one of the earliest courtrooms anywhere in the world, built specifically to hold women accountable, as women, for their own direct role in running a system of mass atrocity, rather than simply for following the orders of men above them. 16 former camp staff sat in that courtroom, men and women who had run the machinery of the camp, and Binz sat among them wearing the number 5. The testimony against her was overwhelming. Survivor after survivor described the same pattern: the whip, the dog, the sudden violence with no warning and no apparent trigger. Witnesses recounted watching her kick a woman without hesitation, without any change of expression. Others described being marched past her on the roll call square and understanding, without a word being said, that eye contact alone could be enough to get you noticed. And through all of it, according to multiple accounts from the courtroom, Binz did not show remorse. She smiled through much of the proceeding, the same unsettling expression the guards would later describe on the scaffold, as if the testimony being read aloud against her belonged to someone else entirely. When her own defense team spoke, they did not try to argue she was innocent. She had already admitted to the beatings herself, on the record, without much resistance. Instead, they argued for mercy on 3 grounds: that she was young, barely into her 20s when most of the conduct described in court had taken place, that she had been honest about what she'd done rather than denying it outright, and, most strikingly, that no one could prove a specific prisoner had died directly as a result of her personal mistreatment. Sit with that last argument for a moment, because it is worth pausing on before we go further. The defense was not claiming Binz was a minor player, or that she'd been following orders under threat of punishment. The defense was, in effect, arguing that terrorizing thousands of already starving, already dying women for years, running a torture block, and training the next wave of guards to do the same, somehow didn't count as directly causing anyone's death. The court did not accept that argument. Binz was found guilty and sentenced to hang. Here's where the story most people think they already know gets a detail that rarely makes it into the shorter version. Binz was not executed alone, and she was not executed the moment the trial ended. The court handed down 5 death sentences from that same proceeding. Binz herself, the camp's head nurse Elizabeth Marshall, a wardress named Greta Bosel, and 2 women who had served as prisoner functionaries, or capos, inside the camp, Carmen Mori and Vera Salvacourt. Mori never made it to the gallows. She took her own life in her cell the night before the executions were set to begin, after her sentence had been confirmed with no path left to appeal. The remaining 4 were taken to Hamelin Prison, the same British execution site used for war criminals across occupied Germany, and the hangings were carried out by Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's chief executioner. By 1947, Pierrepoint had already hanged dozens of convicted Nazi officials in the aftermath of the war, enough that colleagues described him as almost mechanically efficient at the job, treating each execution as a professional task rather than an occasion. For a man who had, by then, executed war criminals from Belsen, the Ravensbrück case was simply the next name on a long list. On the morning of the 2nd of May, 1947, Dorothea Binz walked to the gallows. Elizabeth Marshall, the camp's head nurse who had overseen and enabled its medical horrors for years, was executed that same morning alongside her. It is this detail, the guards being hanged together, that gives the title of this video its meaning, and it is real. But veracity means being precise, not just dramatic, so here's the fuller picture. Greta Bosel and Vera Salvacourt were not hanged that same morning. Their executions followed roughly a day later at Hameln on the 3rd of May. 4 women who had been sentenced together in the same courtroom for crimes committed inside the same camp died within about 24 hours of one another, split across 2 mornings on the same gallows, close enough in time and purpose that history still remembers them as a single reckoning. Not quite close enough to call it one single moment. And that gap matters. History doesn't give a clean answer for why the British split these executions across 2 days at all instead of carrying out all 4 sentences together on the same morning. It might have been nothing more than the practical mechanics of processing 4 condemned prisoners through 1 set of gallows. Or someone in that chain of command may have deliberately chosen to separate Binz, the guard survivors feared above all others, from the others convicted alongside her? We don't have a definitive answer. What we do have is a British executioner who, by 1947, had turned hanging convicted Nazi officials into something close to routine, one morning at a time. What we know for certain is how it ended. Witnesses at the execution described Binz as composed, almost unnervingly so, right up until the end, and her final recorded words were not a confession, and they were not an apology to the thousands of women she had terrorized. According to accounts of that morning, her last words were some version of this. She hoped the people watching didn't think all of them, meaning the guards, meaning the SS women who had run that camp, had been evil. Not a denial of what she'd done, something closer to a request. A woman who had personally supervised a torture block, asking, in her final seconds, not to be remembered as a monster. History did not grant that request. Today, Dorothea Binz is remembered by the name the prisoners gave her while she was still terrorizing them. The beautiful devil of Ravensbrück. Not a footnote in someone else's story. Not a nameless guard in a black and white photograph. The second highest ranking woman in one of the deadliest camps built specifically to imprison women, tried in open court, convicted on the testimony of the people who survived her, and hanged on a British gallows less than 2 years after the war that created her finally ended. Binz was one name among 16 defendants in that first Ravensbrück trial, and that first trial was only one of 7 separate proceedings the British would eventually hold to work through the camp's chain of command. Most of the men and women who ran Ravensbrück day to day were never household names the way the leadership at Auschwitz or Belsen became. They were mid-level staff, wardresses, clerks, nurses, people whose jobs sounded almost administrative on paper. Binz is remembered specifically because survivors made sure she would be. Her name appears over and over in memoirs written by women who made it out, not because a historian assigned her that role, but because enough people who lived through what she did refused to let her disappear into the same anonymous uniform as everyone else. So here's what I genuinely want to know in the comments. Does justice carried out in stages, one hanging at a time across 2 mornings instead of 1, still count as being hanged together? Or does the calendar change what the word together even means? If this is the kind of history you want more of, the kind that doesn't stop at the easy version of the story, subscribe to the channel, and if you learned something today, hit like before you go. It helps this reach more people who think they already know how these stories end. And if the name Elizabeth Marshall caught your attention, the nurse hanged that same morning, whose crimes happened not in the camp's punishment block, but in its supposed infirmary, that's a story for another day. We'll be back with it soon.